Welcome everyone, I'm Cheryl Miller, Director of the Hertog Foundation. We're excited to begin our first Hertog conversation with Professor Harvey Mansfield as our guest. It's often said that a guest needs no introduction. In the case of Harvey, it's actually true for once. Harvard professor, longtime friend of the foundation, most frequent guest on Conversations with Bill Kristol, and professional gadfly to higher education and modern sensibilities, fortunately one with tenure, which Socrates notably lacked. As our audience may know, the Hertog Foundation summer programming has gone completely online. We have 24 fellows, some 80 odd summer course fellows, and right now they're embarking on studies of Plato, Aristotle, and Burke with our excellent faculty. So our departure point for today's conversation is Professor Mansfield's Jefferson Lecture, How to Understand Politics. I'll begin by asking a few questions, and then I'll recognize 4 political studies fellows who have submitted advanced questions for Professor Mansfield. And our wider audience is also invited to submit questions via Zoom's Q&A feature, and there will be some instructions about how to do that shortly appearing. But you can start submitting questions now. There's no need to wait for the official Q&A, especially since we only have Professor Mansfield for a short period of time. So Harvey, to begin, in your Jefferson lecture, you argue for the centrality of thumos for politics. And if thumos is central, then politics is necessarily going to be combative, what we today decry as partisanship or incivility. And further, you argue that there's no escape from partisan rancor. The left is never going to defeat the right, vice versa. The best we can hope for, you say, is wittier, more creative insults. So we don't hear much in defense of partisan politics today. In fact, quite the reverse. Partisanship may be inherent in politics, but is it actually desirable?
Yes, well, very nice to be here again at Hertog Foundation, and I'm happy to see, or to address anyway, those who are in your program, and maybe some of whom I know, and maybe not. So, new people. All right, so partisanship. Well, that lecture was given in 2007, and perhaps I would be a little bit more wary about the extent and profundity of partisanship right now. I think politics is necessarily partisan. And the choice that you have is not to have partisan versus nonpartisan, but partisan versus open partisanship versus suppressed partisanship. And most of the regimes in political history were regimes of suppressed partisanship. That one party had won, it was dominant, and it ruled the roost. And one of the things it did was to shut up the other side. But that other side was always there, latent. It's really quite new in political history. I came in England in the 18th century. I wrote a book about this on Edmund Burke and the discovery of that political parties could be respectable. That it was respectable to have the respectable people in a country differ in their politics. That had always been supposed to be a bad thing, and that the main danger in a republic, and the safety and the durability of a republic was disharmony. And the parties would come to fight each other. So as Burke made an argument against that general view, and it got to America not right away, but almost right away with Jefferson, the Jeffersonian Republicans versus the Federalists. Maybe later, it was only Martin Van Buren in the 1830s who first argued that it was respectable to have 2 different parties, and that the Whigs, he was a Democrat, the Whigs weren't so bad. After all, he had some differences with them, but our system was a system of open partisanship. And so this is actually new. And what has happened now, I think, in recent years is this really pronounced partisanship, which has made people, in a way, rethink or come back to the original view that Republican government requires a little bit more harmony than what we're seeing right now. And that maybe the whole question of partisanship is needs to be reopened. Now, as I say, I don't think that that partisanship can ever be done away with. Partisanship is mainly over different claims to justice. One party and the other party have different views as to what justice requires. And so really, in principle, you would have to have perfect justice that against which nobody could object in order never to have partisanship, either latent or open and actual. So justice and injustice seem to go together. I could maybe just leave it there for the time being. But and now today we've got not only polarization of parties, but also the parties are pretty close in strength. You could have polarization, and that is the parties being gathered at the extremes and those extremes being at some distance from each other, without having such pronounced partisanship, if it was clear that one party was a majority party and expects to win, and the other is a minority that expects usually to lose. But now each party thinks it can win. And if you just look back at those who've recently held the parties that have recently held the presidency, we've gone back and forth from Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump. So each party thinks it can win, so it thinks that each election is winnable. And when you think it's winnable, then you're going to put a lot of effort into it.
So Harvey, in your lecture, you also argue against a scientific conception of politics, which is aloof to human individuality, to honor, to greatness. But in defense of political science as science, one advantage that it has or should have is that it resists politicization. So wouldn't it be better to have more social scientists who think of themselves and their vocation as Max Weber did, who commit themselves to pursuing truth wherever it leads, and who see scholarship as distinct from political action or activism?
Yes, well, that's a famous lecture, or two lectures by Max Weber from 1918 and 19, just about 100 years ago, right at the beginning of the Weimar Republic. And I think I would venture the view that they didn't work, that Max Weber's notion of science as a vocation turned out to be a very bad thing for the Weimar Republic. Weimar Republic was in a terrible condition between the Nazis on the one hand and the communists on the other. And there were very few Republicans, or there was a weak Republican center. What that Republican center needed was the intervention of people like Max Weber, of some standing, to support it. So I think his science as a vocation didn't work out very well for him or for Germany. So yes, there is a difference between being in a classroom and being in politics, and it's a difference which is valuable and should be maintained for sure. But it's easy to carry that too far, and then the vocation of a scientist is, I think, inferior to the life of a philosopher. who, whose life is not necessarily dominated by intensity of feeling as Weber had it, but by thinking and raising questions about everything, including questions about politics. But most every philosopher has had to have some view of politics in his own time. Some, and the Epicureans had a motto: "Live unnoticed." That would be Max Weber in a different presentation. Live unnoticed, but you can't really do that. Then, Machiavelli made a remark to that effect. You can try to live unnoticed, but if you have any brain, people will notice you. They'll want to know what you think, especially a ruler. So you need to have some view of the politics of your own time. And you need to be able to distinguish that from your more detached views. What a political scientist can do is to do a good job of giving both sides of an issue, even if you believe strongly even that one side is better or more relevant for a particular time. So, but you need to make the best arguments for the other side. So I try to do that. I give a course on the history of political philosophy, and I have a couple lectures on Karl Marx. Not a personal favorite of mine, but I pride myself on giving a better view of Marx than a Marxist or most Marxists give. And by better, I mean more fuller, giving Marx more his due as a thinker, which is what he was. So that is possible to do, and it doesn't amount to holding yourself back or regarding politics and the thinking about politics as altogether distinct.
Yeah, related on that. So an alumnus of the Hertog Foundation, Christian Gonzalez, recently wrote an essay for National Review on the relationship of politics and scholarship. And specifically, he asked several prominent right-leaning scholars, Robbie George among them, if conservative academics should advocate for more than just the great books, the works of philosophy and literature you recommend in your literature, but also explicitly seek to advance conservative ideas through teaching and scholarship. And you are among, if not the most, prominent conservative scholar today in academia. And I noticed you weren't interviewed. Maybe this was a deficiency on Christian's part. But I'm going to correct this deficiency and put you on record. So what do you think of this question? Is a self-consciously conservative approach to the social sciences and humanities desirable?
No, he actually didn't ask me. So I would have said yes if he'd asked me, but maybe he knew what I would have said. I'm a conservative in politics, or I call myself a conservative Republican, rather than a Republican conservative. Conservative Republican because I like to win. So I'm also just as much a partisan for the Republicans, or a little bit more, than I am a conservative. Still, that's politics. And the reason why I don't give courses in conservatism or explicitly argue for conservatism in my classes is that I think conservatism is too narrow a point of view, too close to history, and not broad enough, not deep enough. Conservatism is a reaction against liberals. There wasn't any conservatism until there was liberalism. And conservatism is a recent I mean, fairly recent in the history of these things. That is the early 19th century. You first find people who are calling themselves conservatives. So conservatism takes for granted some of the general principles of liberalism. So I would say it's a political position that, generally speaking, is under liberalism. So it takes liberalism for granted. But yeah, and there are, say, the most famous liberal political philosopher would be John Locke. But if you look at John Locke, you see that he says that society needs free speech and toleration. That's kind of good for the left, for the liberals, but society also needs right of private property, which is good for the right. So that's the most philosophic liberal that there is, I would say, Locke. And he's, yes, he offers something for both sides. And so that's what I would say is the case. So that, on the other hand, in the university and academic politics, I call myself a conservative, and I'm happy and proud to claim that the universities ought to do better for the conservatives than they presently do. So it's not that I'm afraid of the name. It's just that I want to go beyond conservatism.
Great. Well, Christian should have asked you. You would have provided balance for his article as one of the only to make that point of view, as you provide balance at Harvard. So I'm going to now recognize some of our political studies fellows who have submitted advanced questions for you. And first up is going to be Pierce Gillen, and he's from Baylor University.
Given your critique, do you think political science, understood as the empirical study of politics with a view towards making predictions and explaining political behavior, is at all useful for understanding politics? And if so, what is the proper role of political science?
Proper role is a subordinate role. I'm not going to tell the majority of my colleagues that they should go home and resign their positions. But I mean, they're the ones who dominate the profession, and I have more to lose from them than they have to gain from me. So I would have to watch out if I were to give them directly everything I believe. But no, I think that it's much better to try to understand things than to try to predict things. Predictions can be long run, like the predictions of Tocqueville, that democracy will democratize itself over the long run. So things like that. But to make such a focus of each election and the attempt to work out who's going to win it is much too narrow. Their empirical science too is not that empirical. What they do in order to achieve their generalizations is to make, mostly these days, use surveys. And surveys are that is simplified questions put to large masses of people, or meant to, or smaller masses meant to represent large masses. And what you get is an average view. And it's a view of politics that is sort of really democratic, that just as when you vote, each vote counts for one man, one person, one vote. So in a survey, the more intelligent or the more intensely believers and so on are put together with everyone else, and you get this kind of average homogeneous mixture, and you don't get the views of the most intelligent. That's what you would think that political science would want to know about as far as opinion is concerned, and that's, I think, means that it isn't empirical in the sense of understanding what a large body of people think in its full diversity. So in order to quantify, they make averages. And when you make an average, you lose both the high and the low, and you get the mediocre. So it tends to, Then also, you're leaving out the ideas or opinions that people have, or you're giving them this average presentation. But ideas are often, or almost always, come from a very few. And you're also, in this kind of empirical generalization, demoting the influence of events. So politics responds to, can be dominated by events. Look at the events that we've had just this year. So the virus and then George Floyd. So those are all individual things, and the political scientist whose method sort of covers over these individual things robs himself from possibility of understanding the whole, and of coming to perhaps a more sensible prediction than you get from the figures.
All right, our next fellow is going to be Michaila Peters, and she's from American University.
It's an honor to meet you, Dr. Mansfield. In your student's guide to political philosophy and this conversation, you've drawn a sharp distinction between the methods and the aims of political philosophy and those of modern social science. So I'm curious what your advice is for aspiring interdisciplinary scholars who find strengths in both fields and want to use their combined insights to address contemporary political challenges.
Yeah. So you've got a kind of middle position. My advice first is to consider the opposition between those two things, and wonder whether one or the other doesn't need to be emphasized. And that it may not be fully possible to love both equally. Right now, the social science approach is obviously dominant, so you mustn't forget that or leave that out or think that you can ignore it. So that's for sure. You have to be able to answer it or to consider it. But to do that, you need a sort of outside point of view. The social scientist is dominated by the you might call it the ideology of social science. First, that political science is just one among the social scientists instead of the master science, as you get from Aristotle and elsewhere in political philosophy. And also that the social sciences are sort of have this character of democratic generalization that I was speaking of in the question before, and that it overlooks what is historical and what is unique and what is accidental, as well as what is permanent. So it's perfectly all right to use social science as long as you're fully aware of its limitations. And I think its main limitation is that it believes it's everything. So it's hard to use it in conjunction with something else, because the social scientists will say that's not social science. And they turn up their nose at and say anecdotal, saying data. In social science, it's you're dependent on data. Those are given things. That's what the word literally means. And political philosophy, on the other hand, is more interested in dicta. That is, the things that are said. Now, the things that are said are a different kind of cause, produce a different kind of cause than the things that are given. And social scientist tends to be reactive. Look at the data and the facts, but those facts can have obviously different interpretations. People say or opine different things about the data, and that's in the ideas that they have. And when you have an idea, it can be a cause only if it's within you, and thus within your power to adopt or adapt or to change. If somebody's mind is involved, that's a mind which could go otherwise, which you can change your mind, and people as a whole change their minds. That can be a general cause. Right now, it looks, say, that Americans or the Democratic Party anyway, is moving to the left. That's a big change. See, and you want to understand that and what that means, what they have in mind, and that's not within the purview really of social science. They can only tell you that certain different percentages of people will have different answers on questions. Should we move to the left? Say.
Our next fellow is Grace Phan Jones from St. John's College of Annapolis.
Hello, thank you for this opportunity to ask you my question.
Hello.
Scientists are viewed and view themselves as apart from politics, but their discoveries and inventions can have a powerful impact on our politics. Is it correct to understand science as apolitical? And if not, how should we understand the relation between science and politics?
Yes, well, this is in a way the same question as the one before about social science, but it's deeper because science is mostly not about human things, or doesn't focus on human things, or if it does, it doesn't regard human beings as different in nature or quality from non-human things. So science adopts and presents itself as adopting general views of nature, which take their character mostly from laws of science, necessary laws of science, which don't respect human wishes or desires. And therefore, science always wants to be objective in the sense of not subject to human, which means accidental or artificial views, but only as to the way things are apart from human opinions. And that means that they don't like proper names. This is what I was talking about in how to understand politics. Because proper names are the way human beings refer to their things or distinctions or boundaries or individualities that they consider important. But what people think is important is not important for science. For science, scientific importance doesn't worry about, makes it virtue of not considering what is humanly important, and therefore not so interested in self-importance, our desire, each one of us, to feel as if we matter. And so that means that science doesn't really have an opinion as to whether science is any good. It assumes that science is good, but it doesn't answer to a human opinion, and the fact that science can be good or bad for human beings isn't relevant to science. So, for example, it might science isn't necessarily against a nuclear war, because after all, science you might learn something from a nuclear war that wouldn't be as available to you otherwise. So science can be a big danger, and it always it offers itself as objective, but its objectivity is humanly humanly out of sight and out of our concern.
Right. And our last political studies questioner is Jack Beyrer from Wake Forest University.
So my question is, today, I think we have a crisis of expertise. Americans are distrustful of elites and experts, and the elites themselves really seem to lack self-confidence. So as a professor at Harvard, where many future elites are informed, what kind of reforms in higher education broadly would you suggest to sort of address this crisis?
This crisis of distrust in experts? That's what you mean? That's what the crisis is, okay. Yeah, well, one could rethink what an expert is. An expert is a specialist. That means an expert knows a lot about a particular activity, and his expertise always is confined or limited, so that if you ask him something outside his expertise, he'll say, that's outside my expertise. So an expert therefore can't tell you how important his expertise is in any particular situation, because he can't compare it with other experts. So recently we've had experts on health talk about the virus, but they were sort of in competition with experts on the economy who would talk about the lockdown. And one of them pulls in one way and the other in the other way. And so you could say distrust of experts is founded on the truth that expertise has this limitation. Now, is there a kind of expertise which is above experts? And that would be philosophy, asking questions about everything. The expert doesn't ask you questions about everything, but only about those things. Say you're an expert in energy, those things which will lead to greater or more efficient use of energy. But you don't take up the question of how much energy does a society need? How much is good for us? How much is a waste? So, on the other hand, you could say distrust of expertise is built into democracy, because democracy means all are equal, and when all are equal, every person's opinion is just as good, especially in his own affairs, as anyone else's. And that means then that the experts can have their opinion, but I've got mine. And if the expert opinion goes against what I think, I'm likely to resist that. That's a very human thing. And this very human thing is very powerful in democracies. So it's quite reasonable, or just to be expected, in other words, understandable, that democracies will distrust experts. Experts all gathered together are called the elite. And that's a word that has bad tone for us, and it's used to denounce more than to praise. Sometimes to praise. You're an elite unit, that's good. But if you're a member of the elite, that means you've probably got pretensions that you should abandon or be quiet about. On the other hand, a liberal democracy has more room for experts and elites. Liberal democracy prides itself on freedom, and freedom often leads to inequalities. As if you're free to use different faculties or unequal faculties, you'll do better and arrive at more and be above others. So we do allow that in our liberal democracy, and we try to take away the undemocratic consequence of it by having different kinds of experts, a plurality of experts. So then we come back to the original point about experts, is that they're specialists, and they're diverse, and there are many different ones. And maybe that's a good thing, because each of them can contradict each other. And also you have to also face this fact that experts love to disagree. If you're an expert in whatever, you're probably against the other experts in energy, or whatever it is that you know. And you show your expertise by showing that you've got a better idea than that other person does. Experts don't necessarily lead to agreement or harmony or concord.
All right, we have a lot of questions in the queue for Professor Mansfield, so I'm going to open it up to our wider audience. And our first questioner is the great James Stoner of Louisiana State University.
Hello, Harvey. How are you? I'm an old student,
Yes.
so I hope you don't mind my interloping a little bit, because I just come as a student. I want to go back to the question of partisanship, if we could. Aristotle and Tocqueville, about whom you've written, of course, so much, spoke as if there were two natural parties, the many and the few, right? Democrats and oligarchs, or Tocqueville might say Democrats and aristocrats. But then you spoke later about the parties in our society as being liberal and conservative. And I wonder if that distinction, which emerges around Burke, is what makes it possible for parties to be respectable. Parties can be respectable if they change themselves from being somehow Democrats and oligarchs into liberals and conservatives. Or are these really the same things in different clothing, so that the liberals are really sort of Democrats and the conservatives are really oligarchs? That's what the liberals say about the conservatives, right? Or are they cross-cutting so that there are sort of democratic liberals and oligarchic liberals, we call them elitists maybe, and democratic conservatives, say populists, and aristocratic conservatives?
I would say all of the above, Jim. And, you've described the whole situation. And yes, there is something different about liberalism versus conservatism. That liberalism for progress, conservatism with its doubts about progress, resistance to progress. But it's also the case that liberals and conservatives are the Democrats versus the oligarchs. I think that's true today. It's true of the Democrats are the party of inclusiveness. That's the main virtue that they offer. That's what they say always that they want to do. Let's be more inclusive. And that turns out to mean that they have a greater interest in the vulnerable, people who might be overlooked and not included. So they don't spend much time speaking of inclusive in the general sense as inclusive of people who otherwise would be overlooked, and those people are vulnerable. So the Democrats focus on the vulnerable and want them to be included. You could say a liberal is a person who spends his entire life looking for people to be sorry for, then looking for vulnerable. It's a friendly way of teasing them. Whereas on the other hand, the Republicans believe that some people are better than others. But they disagree with Aristotle that those few have to be few, that those have to be the few. Or they do their best to do that. So they look for virtues in which people differ, but try to find those virtues to be democratic. And perhaps one of the greatest such virtues is to earn your own keep. People who earn their living are better than people who don't. So people who earn their living are virtuous, and they deserve more. They're not going to exclude the others, but they deserve more. They deserve more attention, more respect. People should listen to them more than they do to people who don't earn, who live on government checks in the mail and depend on others. So they're dependent. If you're dependent, you're not fully free, and a free society needs to promote and respect especially those who best use their freedom. So that would be a way of describing maybe the two parties today from the standpoint of Aristotle and Tocqueville. Now, Tocqueville repeated what Aristotle said, but he used different language, which is more democratic. He says there are two parties, the one wants to increase the power of the people and the other wants to restrict it. So in that formulation, both parties concentrate on the people. And thus, see, the Republicans, they have this big problem that they're not the people's party, essentially. So you might expect them, therefore, usually to be the minority. But that it works out that that's not always so. And this is partly of the cross-cutting that you also spoke of. So I think that's what I would say.
Thank you.
All right, our next questioner is Dominic Pino from George Mason University.
Hello, Professor Mansfield. Thank you for your time.
Hi.
In the Student's Guide to Political Philosophy, you say that both each side in political arguments appeals to the common good. That phrase, the common good, can give some people some collectivist heebie-jeebies, and I was wondering what you think about that hesitation? Do you think that's justified, or do you think that the common good is something that we appeal to all the time and we should just admit it, that we all do it whether we like it or not?
I think the latter. I think you're right, that we all appeal to the common good, whether we like to use that phrase or not. The libertarians, I think, really believe that our society would be much better if everybody were as perfectly as possible selfish. And that's a common good. It's a different kind of common good, to be sure. It's one that emphasizes what people have in common, as opposed to what they share in common. And that's already a distinction which you can find in Aristotle. The benefit in common, and the benefit that's a little. See, everybody has a body, so we have that in common. But then everybody has his own body, so that's not the same thing as living in a society where you have music, and or going to a concert, and everybody can listen to that music, but they don't share in it equally. The musicians, say, have a much greater share than the rest of us who are just listeners. So but that's a shared good, and not just an individual good. So those libertarians, if they want to have music, right, yeah, I suppose they could only have single musicians always playing solos, and nobody ever joining in, because joining in might teach people that it's good to be together, and that maybe human beings have a social nature as well as an individual nature. And I'm not a great student of libertarianism. How they treat friendship, for example, or a marriage, a beautiful marriage, which in a beautiful marriage, you think of yourself as a couple. You're not just partners, as if you find it advantageous to be with this person, but you have something together that you have that exists only because you're together. So, no, that's not something which can be reproduced on the level of society, and so then where people do begin to think of what's in it for me. So that, I mean, it's not that the libertarians have nothing to contribute or to say, but it's a contribution. They don't like to think of them as individuals as contributing, but I think that's a mistake.
All right. Our next questioner is Michael Gonzalez, an alum and also a Baylor grad student.
A question I was wondering earlier in your talk was how a notion of healthy partisanship is distinct from Carl Schmitt's concept of the political as aggression and war. Thumos seems contrary to concession, so isn't something other than Thumos necessary to understand politics as anything other than Schmitt's us versus them dynamic?
Well, there's always eros. The other half of the soul, which I said at the end of my talk, I was abstracting from or not speaking of. So you have Thumos has a serving character. It serves something. You're defending something, but which means that you regard yourself as subordinate to whatever it is you're defending. So and it's usually yourself, you're defending yourself or your country or something. So, but maybe if you defined what yourself is, it would amount to more or extend to more than just your private self, which you would want to defend. And that actually, if you had a principle that free countries should defend themselves, then you're thinking of an order, a kind of world order in which they can live together separately, but still without fighting. And that's a way in which you can accept the distinction between us and them, which is fundamental to politics, but without letting this become an ultimate free-for-all.
And the final student we'll hear from tonight is Robert Zipper of Harvard.
Hello, Professor Mansfield. I
Hi.
have a question about American conservatism specifically. Earlier, you mentioned that conservatism cannot be understood without its reactionary nature to liberalism. But in George Will's book, he argues that American conservatism is fundamentally a classical liberal political tradition, specifically having to deal with Locke's natural rights theory as illustrated in the Declaration of Independence. Do you agree with this assertion that American conservatism specifically is classically liberal?
Yes, I do. I think that's right. That is something which distinguishes our conservatism, that it wants to go back to the founding. We've got something to go back to. But the founding came about because of a revolution. So to be a conservative, you have to be a revolutionary. In a way that you could say the same thing applied to Burke, that he wanted, the conservatism he wanted to defend was that of the regime, limited constitutional monarchy in 1688. But that too was a regime established by a revolution. So, so just because conservatives want to look back to something there, then that means that they have to, they raise the importance of the origins of things. And the origins of things are usually maybe necessarily revolutionary because they're new. So, right, there was this old Daughters of the American Revolution. The organization no longer powerful. It was when I was your age, there was such a thing. Very conservative, but they called themselves Daughters of the American Revolution. So, that means too that American conservatism is more principled. American conservatives can't afford to be as full of levity about principles, the way that an English conservative, somebody like Disraeli, could be. But we American conservatives have to reassert the original principles. That makes us into, in a way, revolutionaries. Because we want to change things at present. We want to change the status quo just the way the liberals do, because the status quo now is too liberal, too progressive. And to guide that change, we have to have principles. Usually the conservative thing is to have habits rather than principles. But it doesn't always work. And all the more in a situation of polarization and very lively, really vicious partisanship.
Well, Harvey, I'm going to take the prerogative of asking you the final question before we close out. Our students are going to be reading another essay of yours, The Value of Free Speech, which was published back in 2018 in National Affairs. And your argument there is that we should give more attention to the content of free speech rather than its limits, to what makes speech worthy and why we should value it. And this subject is of more than theoretical interest for you. A year probably doesn't go by when some student isn't campaigning to purge you from the Harvard campus. You get disinvited. I sometimes worry that you'll get me canceled here at Hertog. And you don't shy away from these battles. In fact, sometimes you seem to court them.
Yeah.
So why are you so often provocative? And how do you think about your own speech?
Right. Yeah, and don't I want to insist on the limits that might be applied against free speech? I certainly do. You're right. I am a little bit provocative, and that's really relative to my situation at Harvard, where I'm one of maybe half a dozen conservatives on the whole faculty, really, and and there are a number of other professors who are conservative but don't say so or don't stand up. So to me, I think that the conservative cause at Harvard needed to be just announced or made public, because otherwise nobody else would. So I took it as my principle that I would never speak up unless no one else was going to. But that turned out to be unlimited loquacity and provocation, just as you were saying. And but you pay for that. The drawback to being provocative is that nobody trusts you. So I've never been on an important or even an unimportant committee of the Harvard faculty for that reason. So my name is fairly notorious, and so they think they know what they're getting, and that they don't need to really consult me. So the more I speak up, the less sort of behind the scenes or communal influence I have. So somebody with a different temperament might do it that other way. And that there is one conservative at Harvard who had the trick of being both persuasive and provocative, and that was James Q. Wilson. He was really the most successful rhetorician in a difficult situation of any conservative that I know of in the American universities recently.
Well, it sounds like a lot of faculty will be following your example soon if being provocative means avoiding committee assignments.
And look, I do believe in the value of speech, for free speech, and that's because I believe in the value of speech. So one thing one can do by being provocative is to kind of carry the argument a little bit further from most others. And so I do worry about counting protests as speech, because a protest is really a pretty poor speech, not really meant to be persuasive or communicative, and it's very irrational. It expresses itself not in arguments but in slogans and shouts and graffiti, and so that's a way of diminishing the value of our speech. Because if you equate that as speech with a carefully composed talk that offers arguments and tries to reach people by persuading them instead of impressing them or shocking them or outraging them, then our free society becomes less capable of governing itself.
Well, we are past our time. Thank you so much, Harvey, for helping us inaugurate this series of conversations. Thanks again, Harvey.
Thank you for having me, Cheryl.